In the heart of a land kissed by the golden savanna, where the sun seemed to cling to the sky, lay the village of Zango, a place of tradition and simplicity. It bustled with life in the mornings and hushed itself to stillness by the evening. Its people lived modestly, relying on the rhythm of the land and the cycle of seasons. Yet beneath this tranquility, like a snake hidden beneath a stone, lurked secrets that would one day unravel the very fabric of their existence. At the center of this tale was a woman named Salima. Salima was neither young nor old, somewhere in that in-between age when youth had just begun to slip away but wisdom had not yet fully settled. Her face bore the marks of hardship, faint lines etched from years of worry and lips perpetually pressed tight as if sealing in untold sorrows. She was a widow, a woman who had lost her husband to the fever that swept through Zango years ago, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that had little patience for the weak. Salima's life was one of endless struggle. She spent her mornings pounding millet, her afternoons weaving baskets, and her nights sewing garments for those who could afford to pay her. Yet despite her tireless efforts, hunger often gnawed at her belly, and her dreams of a better life seemed as distant as the mountains that framed the horizon. One fateful day, as Salima sat in the shade of her crumbling hut, she observed a merchant passing through the village. His wares glinted in the sunlight, brightly polished buckets, bowls, and other household items that seemed almost magical in their shine. The villagers flocked to him like bees to a flower, exchanging old garments and shoes for the promise of something new. It was then that an idea began to take root in Salima's mind. An idea that would set her on a path she could never have imagined. Salima's trade began to thrive. At first, the villagers saw her as a shrewd woman making the most of her opportunities. Her shiny wares became the talk of Zango, and her modest hut started to show signs of improvement. Fresh thatching on the roof, newly plastered walls. Yet, there was something curious about her focus on collecting panties. While most villagers dismissed it as a harmless eccentricity, others whispered of deeper, darker motives. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, bathing the village in amber light, Salima sat outside her hut, counting the day's earnings. The marketplace had been kind, and she felt a rare flicker of pride. But as the evening deepened into night, a strange presence filled the air. The hairs on her arms rose as if the wind carried a warning. A shadow detached itself from the darkness and approached her. It was a man, tall, lean, and cloaked in a dark robe that seemed to absorb the moonlight. His face was obscured, but his voice carried a chilling authority. He called her by name, though she had never seen him before. "You collect much," he said, his voice deep and resonant, "but you have no idea what treasure lies within those rags." Salima's hands trembled as she clutched the coins she had been counting. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am one who sees potential where others see waste," he replied. "And I have a proposition for you." The man had been clear in his instructions. Salima was to collect as many panties as she could, especially those of young women. He had warned her not to question his motives. In return, he promised to return every month with more gold. At first, Salima hesitated. The weight of the pouch in her hands reminded her of the risk she would be taking, but the thought of escaping her life of poverty outweighed her doubts. She convinced herself it was just a harmless transaction. After all, the panties were being discarded, weren't they? The next day, Salima set out with renewed purpose. She visited every corner of the village, offering her gleaming wares in exchange for the items she needed. The villagers, unaware of her true intentions, began to see her as a generous benefactor. But as Salima's collection grew, so did her unease. The weight of the man's mysterious words hung over her like a storm cloud, and at night, she found herself unable to sleep. As the weeks passed, Salima began to notice strange occurrences. Her dreams were filled with whispers in an unfamiliar language, and her reflection in the shiny bowls she carried seemed to flicker with something other than her own face. The villagers, too, began to talk. They noticed that their livestock avoided Salima's house, and that the air around her hut felt colder than the rest of the village. Still, Salima pressed on. She told herself that she was imagining things, that her fears were just the price of success. But deep down, She knew that her deal with the stranger was only the beginning of something much darker. Salima's life began to change in ways she had never imagined. Within weeks of her deal with a mysterious man, she transformed from a struggling widow to a woman of wealth and influence. Her once crumbling hut now stood as one of the finest homes in Zango, its walls freshly painted in vibrant colors, its roof secured with sturdy thatch. Her clothes, once threadbare, now rivaled those of the wealthiest merchants. The villagers, who had once pitied her, now watched her with a mix of admiration and suspicion. But with wealth came whispers. The villagers began to talk, their voices rising in corners and fading into the wind. They questioned how a poor widow could rise so quickly. Some attributed her fortune to hard work and clever trading, but others spoke in hushed tones of darker possibilities. Children claimed to hear strange chants emanating from her home at night, and the village's elders noted the unsettling aura that seemed to surround her. Salima ignored the gossip. She had no time for their suspicions, nor did she care for their judgment. She was too busy fulfilling her part of the bargain. Every day, she ventured out into the village, collecting more and more of the items the man had requested. Her basket, once filled with shiny bowls, was now brimming with old clothes and, most importantly, panties. She avoided looking too closely at the items, as if doing so might reveal the darkness she was desperately trying to ignore. Salima's life became a cycle of transactions. By day, she collected, traded, and built her wealth. By night, she fulfilled the man's requests, placing the collected panties into a locked chest and reciting the words he had taught her. She did not understand the language of the chants, but she performed them faithfully, her voice trembling with each syllable. The nights became stranger. The air in her house felt thick, as though it carried an unseen weight. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and the whispers in her dreams grew louder. Salima tried to convince herself that it was all in her mind, a side effect of her guilt and fear. But deep down, she knew that the deal she had struck was beginning to unravel her very soul. The villagers, too, could sense the change. Their unease turned to fear as more strange occurrences plagued the village. Livestock disappeared without a trace, and several villagers fell ill with mysterious ailments. Some began to avoid Salima altogether, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw her coming. Others, however, could not resist the lure of her shiny wares, even as they whispered about her behind her back. One day, as Salima walked through the marketplace, she overheard a conversation between two women. "She has made a deal with the spirits," one of them said, her voice low but urgent. "They say her wealth is cursed." Salima froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to confront them, to tell them that they were wrong, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned and walked away, her head held high, even as her legs trembled beneath her. That night, as Salima prepared to perform the ritual, she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, she found herself face to face with the village elder, his expression grave. "Salima," he said, his voice steady, "the people are talking. They say you have brought something dark into our village." Salima's blood ran cold. She wanted to deny it, to tell him that it was all a misunderstanding. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that no words could erase the truth that had begun to take root in the hearts of the villagers, and in her own. The village of Zango was no stranger to hardship. Droughts had withered its fields, fevers had claimed its children, and hunger had carved hollows into its people. Yet, the unease that now gripped the village was different. It was not born of famine or sickness but of something far more sinister, something unseen but deeply felt. The whispers about Salima's sudden wealth turned into outright accusations when people began to disappear. It started with a child. Her name was Robbie, a spirited girl no older than 8, known for her laughter that carried like music through the village. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Robbie failed to return home. Her mother, a widow like Salima, searched frantically, her cries echoing into the night. But Robbie was nowhere to be found. The villagers rallied to help, scouring the fields, the forest, and even the dry riverbed. When dawn broke, their efforts yielded nothing but silence. The disappearance of Robbie sent shockwaves through the community. Fear rippled through Zango, sharpening the villagers' suspicions. Many recalled seeing the girl playing near Salima's house the day she vanished. Though no one dared accuse her outright, their eyes lingered on her longer than usual, their gazes heavy with unspoken blame. Salima felt their stares and heard their whispers. She told herself it was mere coincidence, that Robbie's disappearance had nothing to do with her. But as more people began to vanish, her certainty wavered. An elderly woman, last seen delivering yams to Salima's house, was the next to disappear. Then a young man, who had boasted of his strength and bravery, vanished after a late-night trip to the market. Each time, the villagers' eyes turned toward Salima, and their whispers grew louder. Salima's nights grew more restless. She could no longer dismiss the strange occurrences in her home as mere figments of her imagination. The whispers in her dreams became voices, calling her name with increasing urgency. Shadows danced on her walls even when no light was present, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. She began to question the price of the wealth she had gained, but she dared not stop the rituals. The man had warned her. Failure to fulfill her end of the bargain would bring consequences far worse than she could imagine. The villagers, too, were reaching their breaking point. They were a community bound by tradition and trust, and the disappearances threatened to unravel the fragile fabric of their lives. The elders, once hesitant to intervene, began to organize secret meetings. They spoke of curses and spirits, of the need to cleanse the village before it was too late. It was during one such meeting that Amina, a young and courageous woman, stood up. Amina had lost her younger sister to the disappearances and had long suspected that Salima's newfound wealth was tied to the village's misfortunes. "We cannot wait for another to vanish," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "I will find out what she is hiding." That night, while the village slept, Amina crept through the shadows toward Salima's house. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the window, her steps silent on the dusty ground. What she saw inside made her blood run cold. Salima knelt before a wooden chest, her hands moving in practiced motions as she placed the collected items inside. She muttered words in a language Amina did not recognize, her voice low but firm. The air around her seemed to shimmer, as if something unseen was watching. Amina fled, her heart racing and her mind reeling. She knew she had to act quickly, but she also knew that confronting Salima directly would be dangerous. Instead, she returned to the village elder and recounted what she had seen. The elder listened in silence, his expression grave. When she finished, he nodded and said, "Tomorrow we will act." The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the village forever. The night before the villagers confronted Salima, the air in Zango felt thick with tension. Whispers of a meeting at the elder's home traveled from house to house, and the people gathered under the shroud of darkness, their faces lit only by flickering lanterns. Amina recounted what she had seen in Salima's house. Her strange chants, the shimmering air, and the chest brimming with garments. As she spoke, the villagers exchanged fearful glances, their suspicions hardening into certainty. The elder, his voice grave, addressed them. "What Salima has brought upon us is no ordinary misfortune. She has made a pact with forces beyond our understanding. Tonight we will end this, for the sake of our children, our land and our peace." Amina, though frightened, volunteered to lead the group to Salima's house. She could not rest until she uncovered the full truth about her sister's disappearance. Armed with torches, the villagers followed her, their footsteps silent but purposeful. The moment the villagers entered Salima's house, they were struck by the oppressive atmosphere. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the faint smell of something acrid lingered. Salima, caught mid-ritual, scrambled to her feet. Her eyes darted from the open chest to the villagers, her face a mask of desperation. "Leave," she screamed, her voice cracking. "You don't understand what you're doing." But the villagers pressed forward, their torches lighting the small room with chaotic flickers. The elder stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What is this, Salima? What have you brought upon us?" Salima shook her head. tears streaming down her face. "I had no choice," she cried. "He came to me when I had nothing. He promised me a better life, and all I had to do was—" Her voice faltered as she glanced at the chest. The elder knelt and picked up a small charm from the chest. It was intricately carved, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer in the light. The villagers gasped as the charm began to glow faintly in the elder's hand. "What is this, Salima?" the elder demanded. "And who is this he you speak of?" Salima's voice was barely a whisper. "He is not of this world." As the villagers listened in stunned silence, the chest began to emit a low hum. Dark mist poured from it, curling and twisting like living smoke. The symbols etched into the floor glowed brighter, and the air grew colder. Salima collapsed to the ground, clutching her chest as if in pain. The villagers stepped back, their fear palpable. The elder shouted, "Close the chest. Do not let whatever this is escape." Amina, her courage unwavering, stepped forward and slammed the lid of the chest shut. The mist dissipated and the hum ceased, leaving the room in an eerie silence. Salima lay motionless on the floor, her face pale and her breathing shallow. The elder turned to the villagers. "We must take this chest far from here and destroy it. Whatever Salima has brought into our village must never return." As dawn broke over Zango, the villagers carried the chest to the edge of the forest, where they set it ablaze. The flames burned unnaturally high, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and dance. Salima was left in the care of the elders, her fate undecided. With the chest destroyed, the villagers of Zango hoped their nightmare had ended. But as the flames consumed the wood and its dark contents, an ominous energy seemed to ripple through the air. The elders offered prayers, invoking the protection of their ancestors, while the villagers watched in silence, clutching their charms and talismans. Yet, even as the fire turned to ash, the unease in their hearts did not fade. Something told them the darkness they had banished was not gone, it had merely shifted. Salima lay in the elder's hut, her body weak and her mind clouded with fear and guilt. She awoke sporadically, murmuring incoherently, her words a mixture of pleas for forgiveness and warnings of impending doom. Amina stayed by her side, torn between pity for the woman and anger for the havoc she had unleashed on their village. But the destruction of the chest was not the end. As the villagers soon learned, Salima's pact had set forces into motion that could not be undone so easily. Salima's fevered words, though fragmented, revealed the truth of her pact. The man who had come to her that fateful night was no ordinary stranger. He was a messenger of the underworld, a being who thrived on despair and used it to bind the desperate into servitude. In exchange for wealth, he had demanded something small, a chest of panties, each imbued with the essence of its owner. But what Salima had failed to realize was that these garments served as a gateway, allowing the man's dark energy to seep into the lives of those whose clothing she had collected. "I thought it was just fabric," Salima murmured, her voice barely audible. "But each one carries a part of them. Their innocence, their hopes, their souls." The elder's face darkened as he listened. "This is why they are disappearing," he said. "This is why our children and our women vanish. He is taking what you have given him access to." Salima burst into tears, her body shaking with sobs. "I didn't know," she wailed. "I didn't know it would come to this." But the elder's voice was firm. "Ignorance does not absolve you. What you have done has put us all in danger." The villagers, now fully aware of the depth of Salima's transgressions, turned to the elders for guidance. It was decided that a powerful cleansing ritual would be performed to sever the village's connection to the darkness. The ritual would require the participation of every villager, as well as Salima's full confession and repentance. But as the preparations began, a new terror emerged. The mark on Salima's hand began to spread, glowing brighter with each passing hour. The villagers, fearing it was a sign of the man's return, begged the elders to banish her from the village. The elders, however, insisted she stay, arguing that her presence was essential to breaking the pact. As the day of the ritual drew near, the skies darkened unnaturally, and the villagers' livestock grew increasingly erratic. Children complained of strange dreams, and the air grew heavy with the scent of burning wood, even when no fire was present. Salima, now too weak to stand, begged for forgiveness, though she knew it would never be enough. "If I had known what he would take from us, I would have turned him away," she whispered. "But it's too late now." The villagers braced themselves for the ritual, knowing that what lay ahead would determine not only Salima's fate but the fate of their entire village. The dawn of the ritual day arrived heavy with foreboding. The village awoke to an unnatural stillness. No birds sang, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The people of Zango, united by fear and determination, gathered at the great baobab tree, where the elders had prepared the sacred ground for the cleansing ceremony. This was no ordinary ritual. It was one that had not been performed for generations, a summoning of ancestral spirits to banish a malevolent force. Salima, weak and haunted, was brought before the villagers. She sat in the center of the sacred circle, her trembling hands clutching the faintly glowing mark that now covered her arm. Amina stood nearby, her gaze unwavering despite the dread that twisted in her gut. The villagers formed a wide circle around the tree, their faces a mixture of hope and terror. The elders, clad in ceremonial robes, began to chant, their deep voices resonating with the weight of generations past. But the ritual was not without its dangers. As the chants grew louder and the air thickened with spiritual energy, the malevolent force tethered to Salima began to stir. The ground trembled faintly, and the mark on Salima's arm pulsed with a dark light. As the elders chanted, the tension in the air grew unbearable. The villagers felt their hearts pound as the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The mark on Salima's arm began to spread rapidly, covering her shoulder and chest. She screamed, her voice filled with both agony and fear, as dark mist poured from her body, coiling like living snakes around the circle. Then, from the edge of the forest, he appeared. The man who had offered Salima the deal stepped into view, his form wreathed in shadows. His presence chilled the air, and the villagers instinctively stepped back. His voice, deep and resonant, cut through the chants like a knife. "You dare to undo our bargain," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "You think you can sever a bond forged in desperation?" The elders did not falter. Their chants grew louder, their movements more urgent. The baobab tree began to glow faintly, its ancient roots seeming to hum with spiritual energy. The man sneered, raising a hand as the mist coiled around him, forming jagged tendrils that lashed out toward the elders. Amina, clutching her charm, stepped forward. Her voice was steady as she shouted, "This is our village. You will not take another soul." The man's gaze shifted to her, his dark eyes narrowing. "Brave words," he said, his tone mocking. "But bravery will not save you." As the dark energy surged toward Amina, the baobab tree erupted with light. The villagers cried out in awe and fear as the light engulfed the circle, pushing back the mist and forcing the man to retreat. Salima, writhing on the ground, let out a final scream as the mark on her body burst into flames, consuming the dark energy that had bound her. The ritual reached its climax as the light from the baobab tree grew blinding. The man let out an unearthly roar, his form dissolving into the air as the mist dissipated. The ground trembled one last time before falling silent, and the light slowly faded, leaving the villagers in stunned silence. Salima lay motionless in the center of the circle, her body frail and her breathing shallow. The elders, their faces weary but triumphant, declared the ritual a success. The village had been cleansed, but the cost had been great. The village of Zango lay in eerie silence after the ritual. The bright light from the baobab tree had faded, leaving only faint scorch marks on the earth where the dark mist once coiled. The villagers stood frozen, their faces pale and their breaths shallow, as if the weight of what they had just witnessed pressed down on their souls. The elders, drained and trembling, lowered their hands, their chants finally ceasing. Salima's body remained in the center of the circle. Her glowing mark had vanished, leaving her skin scarred and blistered. Her chest rose and fell weakly, and her face was a mask of exhaustion and remorse. The villagers began to murmur, their fear slowly giving way to anger and confusion. What would become of Salima? And was the village truly safe now that the pact had been broken? As the villagers dispersed, returning to their homes with heavy hearts, the elders carried Salima back to the elder's hut. Her body, frail and scarred, seemed to weigh little, as if the ordeal had drained her of all vitality. Amina followed closely, her mind racing with thoughts of her sister and the darkness that had nearly consumed their village. Inside the hut, the elders laid Salima on a mat and began tending to her wounds. Amina watched from a corner, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wanted to hate Salima, to blame her for the horrors she had unleashed. But as she looked at the broken woman before her, she saw not a villain but a victim, someone who had been consumed by desperation and deceived by forces far beyond her understanding. When Salima awoke, her voice was weak but clear. "Is it over?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously around the room. The elder knelt beside her, his face stern but not unkind. "The chest is destroyed, and the darkness has been banished, for now. But the scars of your actions will remain, Salima. The village will heal, but it will not forget." Salima's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered. "I only wanted to survive." The elder sighed deeply. "Survival is not enough if it comes at the cost of others' lives. You must live with what you've done, and you must make amends in whatever way you can." The days that followed were marked by cautious recovery. The village slowly returned to life. Children began playing in the square again, their laughter tentative but real. Livestock grazed peacefully, no longer skittish or disturbed. But the villagers' trust in one another had been shaken, and their glances toward Salima's hut remained wary. Salima, under the watchful eye of the elders, began her penance. She worked tirelessly to repair the damage she had caused, helping rebuild the homes of those who had lost loved ones and offering prayers at the graves of the missing. But she knew that no amount of labor or repentance could erase the memory of what had happened. Amina, too, carried scars from the ordeal. Though the darkness had been banished, she felt its shadow lingering in her heart. The loss of her sister weighed heavily on her, but she found solace in the knowledge that her bravery had saved others. She often visited the baobab tree, sitting beneath its ancient branches and speaking softly to the spirits she believed had helped protect their village. The weeks after the ritual marked a slow and uneasy recovery for Zango. Though the village had driven away the darkness, the scars it left behind ran deep. The loss of loved ones and the unsettling memory of what had transpired lingered in every corner of the community. Yet, amidst the tension and mistrust, there were glimmers of hope. The villagers began to rebuild, not only their homes but their bonds. Central to this process was Salima, who, under the watchful guidance of the elders, began a journey toward redemption. Salima knew that her path would be difficult. The villagers avoided her gaze and whispered behind her back. Children, once carefree and curious, now turned and ran when they saw her. But she accepted this as her burden. Each morning, as the sun rose over the hills of Zango, she knelt beneath the baobab tree and prayed for forgiveness, not just from the spirits, but from the people she had betrayed. Her prayers were only the beginning. The elders devised a series of penance tasks for Salima, tasks that would both repair the village and show her commitment to atoning for her actions. These tasks were not easy, but Salima faced them with quiet determination, knowing that each step forward brought her closer to reclaiming her place in the community. Salima's tasks were grueling but transformative. She worked alongside the villagers, rebuilding homes and tending to fields, her hands blistered and her body weary. Though many avoided her at first, her quiet determination began to soften their hearts. Slowly, the whispers turned from accusations to cautious words of acknowledgement. Amina, who had been one of Salima's harshest critics, found herself drawn to the woman's efforts. One day, as Salima labored in the fields, Amina approached her with a bundle of tools. "You shouldn't do this alone," she said simply. From that day forward, Amina became a reluctant ally, helping Salima with her tasks and offering her quiet encouragement. The elders, too, began to recognize Salima's sincerity. After weeks of tireless work, they summoned her to the baobab tree. "You have made great strides, Salima," the elder said. "But redemption is not just about labor. It is about understanding the pain you have caused and ensuring that such pain is never inflicted again." Salima nodded, her voice trembling as she replied, "I will spend the rest of my life making amends if I must." As the village continued to heal, Salima became a symbol of resilience and redemption. Her story served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of desperation and the power of forgiveness. Amina, inspired by Salima's transformation, began to rebuild her own life, finding new purpose in helping others heal from their losses. By the time the season turned, the village of Zango had begun to thrive once more. The crops grew tall, the children's laughter returned, and the air felt lighter, as if the darkness had finally lifted. Though the scars of the past remained, they served as a testament to the village's strength and unity. The seasons turned, and life in Zango slowly began to feel normal again. The crops flourished, the livestock thrived, and the people, though scarred, began to laugh and sing as they had before. But amidst the village's resurgence, one person remained a constant reminder of the past: Salima. Her presence still drew mixed reactions from the villagers. Some forgave her efforts, while others could not look past the darkness she had unleashed. Salima herself accepted this burden. She had long ago resigned herself to the reality that redemption was not an endpoint but a lifelong journey. Guided by the elders and supported by the cautious friendship of Amina, she continued her penance. Her story had become a lesson for the village, a tale of the danger of unchecked desperation and the strength it takes to rebuild after unimaginable loss. The elders, however, knew that Salima's journey was not yet complete. The spiritual scars of her pact lingered, not only within her but across the village. To truly break free from the shadows of the past, they determined that one final act of redemption was necessary. The elders announced that Salima's final task would be to confront the spiritual remnants of her pact in the sacred grove deep within the forest. This grove, untouched by human hands for generations, was a place of immense spiritual power. It was said that the ancestors could be summoned there to cleanse even the deepest wounds of the soul. Salima accepted the task without hesitation. She knew this was her chance not only to redeem herself fully but also to ensure that the village would no longer be haunted by her actions. Amina volunteered to accompany her, unwilling to let her friend face the unknown alone. The journey to the grove was long and arduous. As they walked, Salima shared stories of her life before the pact, of the poverty and despair that had driven her to such desperate measures. Amina listened silently, her respect for Salima growing with each word. By the time they reached the grove, their bond had deepened into something unbreakable. The elders began the ritual as soon as they arrived. Their chants filled the grove, resonating with the natural rhythm of the forest. Salima knelt at the center of the circle, her head bowed and her hands clasped in prayer. The air grew heavy, and the ground began to tremble as a dark mist rose from the earth. Salima did not flinch. She stood, her scars glowing faintly as she faced the swirling mist. The force tested her, whispering threats and promises in equal measure, but she remained steadfast. "You have no power over me anymore," she said, her voice calm and steady. With those words, a brilliant light erupted from her body, pushing the mist back until it dissipated completely. The grove fell silent, and Salima collapsed to the ground, her body spent but her spirit at peace. The elders declared the ritual a success, and Salima was carried back to the village. As she walked into the village at dusk, the people gathered to meet her. Though their trust had been shattered, they could not deny the strength and courage she had shown. One by one, they began to welcome her back into their lives, their hearts softened by her unwavering determination to make things right. Salima's redemption was not a single act but a lifelong journey. She became a guiding force in the village, helping others navigate their struggles and teaching them the value of unity and forgiveness. Though her scars remained, they were no longer a mark of shame but a testament to her resilience.